Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today we are here with Michael Bracy, co-founder of the Music Policy Forum.
Hey, Michael, great to see you. Thanks for taking the time to interview today. I'm looking forward to learn more about your background. And then we have some questions really to kind of get your vision of the future. But
Sounds
why
great.
don't you just start with, you have Coltrane in the back. Obviously, you have a lot of interest in music and you are dedicated to music. But when did you like say to yourself, I want to pursue a career involving music?
That's a great question, Jim, and thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I've been incredibly fortunate to work at the intersection of public policy and music and documentary film for a little bit over 20 years, and I'm one of those. Like many of us, I don't have the gift. I'm not a musician, but music has been central to my life as long as I can remember. And when I started working in policy in Washington and really understood that, back around, kind of around the turn of the century, right, as we were starting the sort of transition from an analog to a digital music industry, we realized that there were just some real gaps in knowledge among policymakers and among music stakeholders about what the policy decisions would mean and should mean. And so I've been really fortunate to be a driver of two different nonprofits, the Future of Music Coalition that I co-founded in 1999, and then the Music Policy Forum, which I co-founded in 2017. And I just really have enjoyed being part of this community of activists and connectors and advocates and researchers and policymakers and industry leaders that are just doing what you're doing. We're all just trying to puzzle this through together and see who's got good ideas, who's got lessons learned, and how do we apply them in a very pragmatic and actionable way.
Yeah, well, that's interesting that you combine those two careers, because policymakers and the creatives are two different mindsets. They see the world through different lenses, and they see their issues, totally different. How do you see bridging that gap between the creative musicians who really would just like to perform and showcase their work, and the people who are making policies that can influence how they do that?
Well, it's really hard, right? Because when you think about the diversity of interests in the music community, it's overwhelming. People are involved in music with so many different reasons, and they have so many different ambitions. And some are trying to make a living, some just want to play in the church choir. I mean, it's all over the map. And the policy implications for those different stakeholders are radically different in terms of what they would like to see come out of the policy community. Our basic feeling and the work that we've been doing for a long time is that there's not ever going to be like a simple 5-point plan and just a basic agenda, just do these things and you're going to fix, music policy. Our feeling is that this is an ongoing dialogue that needs to be happening constantly. And we all have an obligation, no matter if we're advocates or policymakers, wherever we sit, we benefit from music and we have to do what we can do to be intentional about how we engage with music. So as we think about local government, we think about coming out of the pandemic, again, there's not necessarily a clear roadmap for every city or every state or even the federal government. But what we really want to emphasize is just having intention around what can we do? What do we have control over in the policy sphere, in philanthropy, and how does that apply then to, again, this diversity of interest? So it's really hard. But
Mhm.
again, we've kind of embraced that for over 20 years. I mean, we don't mind the fact that it's hard. It's still worth doing.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. There was our last Sociable City News. We featured that Berlin now is recognizing that music venues are cultural
Yeah. Yeah.
centers, and that they should be treated as such, which puts them into kind of the same class as the symphony or the museum or whatever, that they provide a cultural value. One thing I always like to say is that music is the heartbeat of sociability,
Yeah.
and that what we've seen as we've lost that social experience in the public space, obviously in private we've been able to socialize and entertain, but in the public space, not public meaning, venues where you go to performances or festivals where you listen to music outside, we lost that kind of sociability, and in turn we lost that kind of heartbeat
Yeah.
of sociability, which is music. And how do you see music as reemerging as people begin to reemerge into the spaces that they used to be in. Do you think it'll still have the same value of facilitating socializing, or do you think it's going to become more of a commodity? Because in some ways, in my opinion, anyhow, with the streaming service and other things that happened, it almost became more of a commodity than as a vehicle for sociability.
Yeah, no, this has been one of the structural challenges that we've faced, really going back to the 1970s when we started to have consolidation in the music industry that sort of ended the idea of standalone music businesses, instead to sort of, integrated conglomerates that do all sorts of different things, with music just being part of the toolkit. And, part of what the pause is given all of us, in the music community and the people who think about this stuff, is this opportunity to hit the reset and say, we don't want to just kind of get back to where we were in December 2019. We really want to think about what does it mean to create stronger, more resilient, and more equitable music ecosystems. And again, what does that look like? Not just in terms of we're going to turn off Twitter for a day or something, but really digging into what does that mean in terms of infrastructure, venues, the ability for musicians to make a living, how we engage with audiences and bring them in. Because ultimately, again, music, and this has been a problem in Washington, D.C. as long as I've been doing this work, music kind of gets lumped in, I think, to your point, as a commodity and sort of competing with video games and sporting events and other places where people can spend time and their money in the consumer economy. When music, of course, is much bigger than that. And not to be hokey, but music is speech. Music is how we grieve. Music is how we connect with people. And we need to have a fundamental realignment on the policy questions about why is that important, particularly in a time in the United States where we are broken. We are facing just enormous pain and heartbreak and anger. And music is a big part of, how we're going to navigate getting back to what the next normal is going to look like. And hopefully, again, not to be overly romantic about this stuff, but over time, music is part of our toolkit as humanity for how we can come to some broader understandings about what does it mean to sort of live in these eras. So, what we're looking for, really, again, are trying to take it out of that 10,000 foot sort of big picture stuff I was just talking about, and trying to think about what does it look like in a meaningful and actionable way for music to get back, again, not just where it was, but to get back stronger and get back better. And again, on the policy side, that's completely scalable, local, regional, federal, all across the board.
I mentioned before these short videos that were produced for our summit, and one of them was from Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, Minneapolis is the home of Prince, but it's also the home of the Floyd protests, and also the First Avenue was the genesis of the independent venue movement. So Minneapolis has this really deep roots. And when they interviewed Linda Roberts for this video, at the end, somebody asked her, "What would you have done differently?" And she said, "Well, if we were to do it differently, we would have opened up more spaces for cultural exchange, because we lost those places where people could understand each other and communicate with each other. And music always is part of a revolutionary movement. There's always a fringe group of people, either through their words or their music or the people who follow them, that lead revolutions. So how do you combine those two kind of concepts that, on the one hand, the protests may have been better served if there were more organized places for people to listen to music, learn about each other's culture, and have communication outside of just in the protests? And then moving forward, what do you envision in terms of the new music? Do you think this will mark a revolution in what people write about in music, the transition from this lockdown and social justice? Do you see artists actually embracing this as part of leading a revolution?
Those are really completely appropriate and completely complicated questions. And so I'm going to try to give a couple of answers to it. I think one is, to build off of what I was saying a minute ago, we need to acknowledge that we have structural market failure in the United States as relates to our music economy. And that's something that not everybody acknowledges, but that, through a series of, part of it is just sort of end game capitalism stuff. Some of it is again, a lack of antitrust oversight. Some of it is not really being centering the creator and sort of the ongoing conversations about intellectual property and new digital platforms. There's a bunch of complicated factors, lack of arts funding. There's a bunch of stuff that comes together to basically say that the commercial marketplace, where we sort of left it to allegedly the marketplace really hasn't been fair. It has been fair for decades. And so musicians are navigating this new world in a sort of environment where they don't have a lot of power, they don't have a lot of agency. And then with this massive transformation that we've seen over the last 20 years, a lot of it been exciting and great. I don't mean to say like the old industry was great and the new one's awful. I mean, it's always complicated. But now that we have new platforms for recording, distributing, making music available for consumers to access music, everything is just completely new. And the challenge, I think, and where we can get into trouble is that it's not for like you and me to figure out what that looks like, right? I mean, I have a very personal experience of how I relate to music as a consumer that was based in my youth in listening to radio and going and buying magazines and going to record stores. And, there's a way I experienced music that was very common, for when I grew up. Well, that's totally different. And the digital natives have a fundamentally different understanding to how you create, how you share, how you access, and then where you're willing to put money and what that's going to look like in terms of economic structures. So what we want to see is a distinction between what we would like to see government and philanthropy provide, which is this underlying cultural infrastructure, which to your point is access to spaces, is access for people to gather, are the tools that people need, creative entrepreneurship, training programs, broadband, kind of a rethink of what we do with public media as we move into the next era, thinking about what are the pieces that we can and should provide from the public sector side, and that can be augmented by philanthropy if the government isn't going to do it. But then we don't want to be top down and say, okay, we're going to have an art czar that's going to tell us what culture needs to look like. And I think if we can get to a point where you've seen that, and you see a lot of this in the creative youth development field sector, organizations like Youth on Record in Denver or Totem Star in Seattle, organizations all across the country that are empowering youth through music, but then getting out of the way to let them go where they want to go with it. And that's going to, really be important because again, I think that there's Apple TV Plus just rolled out this really lovely documentary series about the year 1971 and the intersection of social change and music making. And it's a wonderful series and it's super inspiring. It's got great old footage. But we can't be trying to force, be standing around saying, where's the next John Lennon? I mean, that just isn't how this can work. That's going to have to come organically. So, and then, but we have to tie it again. There is a direct correlation to what you said before about, where are the voices who are kind of leading social change? How is that sort of influencing our conversation? How are we healing with the realities of the marketplace and how musicians make money and the concessions that they have to make to be viable in a very hyper consolidated music industry on the label side, promoter side? I mean, it's all very, very tightly, it's a winner take all economy where if you're in it, you're going to do really well. And if you're not in it, it's really hard to kind of make any kind of living whatsoever. So, but if we can help figure out what that core infrastructure looks like and how policymakers can help support that, we can over a couple of decades, allow that next generation to really flourish.
Now, Springsteen is going to be the first to start on Broadway.
Yeah.
And it's his life history. And, he started out as a busker, and then playing in bars and then small venues. And then, now he's playing on Broadway. And so when we think about music and how people succeed in it, there is that role of the music venue, the karaoke rooms, and then the evolution to, becoming a performer, and then your first performance on the sidewalk. I had a friend who was a musician, and she was so frightened to perform on the sidewalk in downtown Santa Cruz, but those are those steps that everybody has to take in order to, build that confidence. And I know that you've been involved in helping craft the methodology by which venues can return. Obviously, in the US, we're fortunate with such a high rate of vaccination, but you read about Japan and countries in Europe, they're still struggling with surges and restrictions and closures. And so, there's going to be a while yet. And so what do you see as the future of venues? And then how do you distinguish between the DJ music venue versus the live music venue? and the small kind of less than 300 or less than 500 occupancy venue, and the
Yeah.
1,000 plus or 2,000 plus venues to arenas and stadiums.
So much in there, so much in there. So let me take a couple different stabs at that. I think first, part of what NEVA, the National Independent Venue Association, and others have helped do the Save Our Stages campaign, is really popularize something that we've been talking about for 20 years, and thank God others came in to help carry that weight, because clearly we hadn't broken through in the messaging, but stuff that you guys know very well, which is the ladder of venues, which is the importance of having a whole lot of different experiences for musicians to learn their craft, to get good at what they're doing with live performance, to understand, how do you build audience organically. And those have to be, again, those everything, just like what you said. I mean, that's busking to small rooms, to theaters, that's how you work your way through. And that ultimately is how we're going to have a healthy and sustainable, live music ecosystem, if we have those type of rooms. The problem, again, is that, you just see the cycles of development where the live rooms are parts of neighborhoods that are transitioning and are so central to sort of, the kind of the local urban vibrancy that we're all excited about, we all like, but then we don't have really practical solutions to then how do those venues stay sustainable when we see the corresponding housing increases and just, cost of space that they help inspire. So we've got one thread there is how do we, sort of maintain those. The other, and we just very quickly, I mean, huge respect and shout out to, Mark and Bev at the Music Venue Trust in the UK, who, since we got to know them 7 or 8 years ago, have really helped inspire us in terms of how we frame it and talk about this stuff and understand this stuff. And they've been great partners. But to your other point, just briefly, yes, so Music Policy Forum has run an initiative called Reopen Every Venue Safely, or REVS. And we started that in April of 2020. With the understanding that we don't know when live music can restart, but we know at some point the science will say it's time to go and we can do it. And so what we've created is a network of pilot cities. Right now we have 18 pilot cities across the United States that are basically collaborations between local government, public health, venues, employees, music employees, music workers, musicians, to basically say, what do these protocols look like? How are we actually going to do this? How are we going to talk about it? How educate the public? And, as you can imagine, in a country as complicated and diverse as the United States, if with 18 pilots, we have 18 different dynamics. The political dynamics, or social dynamics, or economic and class dynamics, the racial dynamics, is really, really complicated. What I'm concerned about in the short term is that I feel like, first of all, I feel like a lot of our smaller independent venues, not only in music, but also in theater and dance and, across cultural sectors, already were extremely vulnerable going into pandemic. And what worries me is looking at like the NBA playoffs and seeing packed arenas where people are safe, feel safe going, not wearing a mask because you are mandated to have a vaccine. And I think that the larger industries like baseball, like basketball, that, and I think we'll see this with the larger concert venues, with Live Nation and the other large concert fellows, they're going to be able to create an experience that the general consumer is going to feel pretty safe. And they're going to be like, okay, it's, everybody's vaccinated. It's good to go. I can go be there. But they may be feeling less safe with the smaller venues or the local clubs, and certainly, like the local, punk show or something, is going to be harder. So we're going to have to be really smart to figure out how we navigate that, not only, from a standpoint of just the economics and sort of getting, back on our feet and trying to get money back through the system, but also, I mean, there's a lot of unanswered health questions. I think you referenced that in terms of some of the rest of the world. And the emotional and mental health toll that this crisis has taken on our venue employees is really overwhelming. And we are very concerned about exacerbating what already is a really difficult situation, and asking them to, not only be trying to get a venue up and going again and trying to put on nice events and trying to just, kind of just follow protocols, but having to play security guards and having to deal with unruly patrons who are like, I don't want to follow your rules. So I don't have to. The CDC says they don't.
That's going to be a big challenge. I mean, before this pandemic, it was hard to get security people, and the cost of insurance was going up. And
Exactly.
you had threats from not only active shooters in venues, but sexual harassment and assaults. And and now you have the reorganization of the way police will manage these nightlife districts. It'll be quite challenging. So
Yeah.
we're a little bit over our time, but
Oh, sorry.
this has been very fascinating. No, it's not your fault. It's my fault for asking the questions. But here's the final point. 18 months from now, if we have this conversation again, in 1 minute, just summarize what will be the music scene, and what policy do you feel will be the most important change?
Well, the biggest change will be if the Biden administration is able to follow through on what we anticipate they're going to be willing to do, which is integrate music policy across the entirety of the federal government, to understand that HUD policy, education policy, health and human services, public health, all these, music fits into virtually everything that the federal government does. And we need to be able to accelerate a process to understand what that looks like in a pragmatic way. So the $16.25 billion that's been invested in the shuttered venue operator grants is not just a one-time only, emergency fluke, that there's a meaningful engagement around funding, around policy that can lead us, down the road. The corollary to that also is, I just think people are ready for music. I just hope people get out. I hope they see their friends. I hope they dance. I hope they sing. I hope we're really just able to understand that we've benefited from technology and from streaming, but let's go see some people. Let's go sweat a little bit. Let's go have fun.
That sounds great. Great conversation. Well, thank you, Michael. This is informative. I could probably go on for another hour with you, but
Thank you, Jim.
it's
Thanks for all your
very
work.
interesting.
Been a real inspiration for a long time.
Okay, well, thanks.